Hola chicos, happy martes, happy Tuesday. Today I've got more rock and roll as a reflection of the social fabric in US history for you. And what I've made for you is a Loom video where I go through some slides, 5 slides to be exact, on how rock and roll music has influenced and has reflected the social fabric of society. So what I've done to be a little more efficient, since it's already kind of a long video anyway, is I've gone through the slides in both English and Spanish, but I've alternated. So I go English, Spanish, English, Spanish, English to the 5 slides. So that might be hard for some of you who aren't Spanish speakers or aren't English speakers, but all the slides are available to you in both languages if you find the slideshow, which is linked on today's assignment. I will talk about that assignment at the other end of this video, but first, let me talk through these slides with you, just so you have my voice describing to you, in addition to the information that's on the slides, the representations of the social fabric of the United States of America through the history of rock and roll music.
Okay, here we are in Loom. And to talk about rock and roll music, or better, before we can talk about rock and roll music, we got to talk about the roots of rock and roll music. Rock and roll music is predominantly a black form of music. It came from black communities, and so we have to go back in black history. And in the United States of America, that brings us all the way back to the slave plantations. And actually, even before that. Because if you think about the kind of music that was popular in the United States, historically speaking, most of that music had European influence. And so when you think about like European music, you might think of like classical stuff like Mozart or Beethoven or Bach, lots of pianos and violins and harps and fancy sophisticated stuff like that. But black music doesn't come from Europe. It comes from Africa. That's a whole different continent with a whole different kind of music. And when you think about the instrument that dominates in lots of forms of African music, the instrument that you probably are thinking of is the drum. Now, fast forward to Africans and African Americans who are working slave plantations in the American South. Most of them don't have access to the drum. It was actually banned by a lot of the slave owners because it was feared that the drum would be used in starting some kind of a slave insurrection. But one thing black people still had was their bodies. And so you had a lot of this, clapping. You had people using their bodies as a substitute for the drum. And they also had their voices. And so these are the primary instruments that black people use on slave plantations. So I'm going to show you a song that's called Ho Emma Ho. And it's a quintessential example of the kind of song that you might hear on a slave plantation that is going to serve as a root for the rock and roll music that we're studying this week. So give this one a listen here.
Ho Emma Ho, you turn around, dig a hole in the ground. Oh, Emma Ho. Oh, Emma Ho. You turn around, dig a hole in the ground. Oh, Emma Ho.
And so what you're hearing there is a style of music called call and response. And call and response is exactly what it sounds like. It's got a lead singer, they call out, and then you got a group of people who respond. This is something that's utilized often in rock and roll. If you think about songs, you'll find plentiful examples. And so this is one of the styles of music popular on slave plantations that's going to serve as roots for rock and roll. I also want to show you another part of black history, another style of music that's important for influencing the development of rock and roll. And that took place in black churches with gospel music. So I've got a song right here, a gospel song from a black church. Let's take a listen and break it down a little bit. So you can already see in the back, you got the choir back there. You got the lead singer up front. They're clapping. They're using their hands to make a beat. And they're about to do the same kind of call and response that you saw on slave plantations. But here is taking place in a church.
This morning when I rose.
And watch this old black lady about to cut loose and get down. headbanging way before heavy metal was even a glint in anybody's eye. And there's another thing about black music, guys, a lot more emotional than the European white music that dominated American society. I mean, look at all the audience in the church. They're on their feet. They're having a good time. And getting into your music emotionally, getting your body into your music is something you definitely see in rock and roll. Look at this old lady go. And so again, guys, thinking about the social fabric, look at how like this music from slave plantations to black churches is influenced by the society, right? Like the music, the slave plantations and the black churches, institutions in society that are contributing to the development of this music that will eventually be called rock and roll. And that goes back to like the African influence. And so there's a lot of good stuff right here that shows you examples of how music is reflected by the social fabric, by the society that it's created in. Español para esta diapositiva. Y esta diapositiva se enfoca en un periodo de la historia estadounidense en que la gran migración, the Great Migration, sucedió. Y ustedes ya han estudiado la gran migración. La gran migración fue la mudanza de muchas personas negras que vivían en el sur hacia el norte. Y estudiábamos esto cuando vimos el renacimiento de Harlem, the Harlem Renaissance en Nueva York, que muchas de esas personas negras migraron del sur. Y sabemos las razones que personas negras querían huir del sur. El sur Jim Crow no fue un lugar bueno para personas negras. Es no que no había racismo en el norte, había racismo, pero mucho menos en el norte. Mucha más oportunidad en el norte que el sur. Y esa razón que muchas personas negras salieron del sur durante este tiempo. Y hay una conexión a la música aquí también. Porque cuando las personas negras salieron del sur hacia el norte, ellos llevaban su música con ellos. Entonces están llevando la música negra del sur hacia el norte. Y el tipo de música que fue popular entre los negros en el sur se llama los blues. Los blues es la forma de música negra del sur. Y cuando piensan en los blues, when you think of the blues, ¿en qué piensan? Piensan en la tristeza, ¿sí? Eso que significa the blues, estar triste. Y tiene razón, ¿sí? Porque el sur, Jim Crow, fue un lugar muy triste para personas negras. Aquí es un ejemplo de una canción que representa a los blues. Y van a oír como la tristeza en ella. Muy lenta, muy como triste. Este es el tipo de música, los blues, que había en el sur. Y chicos, esto es muy diferente que la música negra del norte. Como dije, en el norte hay mucha más esperanza y mucha más oportunidad para los negros que vivían allá. Y podemos ver la reflexión de esta felicidad en la música negra del norte. Aquí es una canción que se llama Caledonia. Es por un grupo, un hombre que se llama Louis Jordan, que vivía en el norte. El estilo de música se llama Boogie Woogie. Es muy diferente que los blues, ¿sí? Voy a adelantarnos un poco. Louis Jordan.
She long, lean, and lank, and they had nothing to eat, but she's my baby. And I love her just the same. Crazy about that woman called Caledonia is her name. Caledonia! Caledonia! What makes your big head so hard?
Kick.
I love you. Love you just the same.
Entonces, chicos, pueden oír la diferencia, ¿sí? Hay mucha más felicidad en este tipo de música que en la música de del sur. Y lo que pasó es cuando personas negras salieron del sur hacia el norte y llegaron al norte, había una mezcla. Los estilos norteños y los estilos sureños, estos dos estilos de música, empezaban a mezclarse. Y lo que creían es una forma de música completamente nueva. Porque Boogie Woogie del norte, los blues del sur, ninguno de esos tipos de música son rock and roll. Pero la música que vas a oír en este momento es mucho más cerca al rock and roll. Es una canción que representa a la mezcla del sur y del norte. Se llama Hoochie Coochie Man por Muddy Waters. Y él fue de la ciudad de Chicago, en que había muchas mezclas de culturas del sur y del norte. Entonces, aquí es el comienzo de la canción. Similar a los blues, ¿sí? Es una canción un poco lenta. Tiene la guitarra otra vez. Pero a ver lo que pasa en esta parte. Aquí es la influencia del norte. Oye el piano. Hoochie Coochie Man es el nombre de la canción. Y chicos, otra vez, la mezcla. Pueden ver otra vez The Social Fabric, el entramado social, como música del sur y música del norte tenían como sonidos diferentes a causa de las situaciones diferentes en estas dos regiones. Y como la mezcla de esas regiones, de la música de estas regiones, a causa de la gran migración, formó una música nueva que es un poco más cerca al rock and roll. Todavía no hemos logrado la creación de rock and roll oficial, pero estamos acercando. Y la historia social de los Estados Unidos y personas negras está informando ese progreso hacia la música de rock and roll, entramado social. Back to English. This slide focuses on the birth of rock and roll. So remember, the previous two slides, we're not talking about rock and roll music yet. We're talking about the music that's eventually going to become rock and roll music. The music, call and response music sang on slave plantations, the gospel music played in black churches, Southern blues, Northern boogie woogie, and the rhythm and blues mixture of those two styles of music that formed in cities like Chicago and New York when Southern blacks migrated north, bringing their musical styles with them. All of that was music that would eventually become rock and roll. But the music that finally was rock and roll, the two musicians that most historians give credit to as the godfathers, the founders of rock and roll, you're looking at them right here, Little Richard and Chuck Berry. And you already saw Little Richard a little bit. I want to show you a little bit of Chuck Berry too, because Chuck Berry has an important musical influence that's definitely a part of rock and roll that you didn't hear when you heard like Muddy Waters, for example.
Maybelline. Oh, Maybelline, can't you be true? Oh, Maybelline, why can't you be true? You started back doing the things you used to do.
So this is Chuck Berry. He's playing the song Maybelline. What do you hear in Maybelline that you didn't hear in Muddy Waters, Hoochie Coochie Man, for example? You hear that twang? That twang is the influence of country. Chuck Berry grew up listening to a lot of white musicians playing country music. He grew up listening to a lot of black musicians too, playing rhythm and blues. And so Chuck Berry is a representation of those two different pieces of society, those different social influences. He is the embodiment of that mixture. And what came out is what most people call rock and roll music. You're about to see his infamous duck walk here. Chuck Berry doing the duck walk. That burns the quads, I tell you what. So that is Chuck Berry, along with Little Richard, the godfathers of rock and roll. Another thing that was important about these two guys, A, they had attitude, and attitude was an important part of rock and roll. And B, they were young. And so these guys, for the white teens that were listening to rock and roll music, were a lot more idolizable, to just invent a word, than some of those older rhythm and blues guys from the 30s and 40s. People looked up to Chuck Berry and Little Richard, white kids and black kids, and their youth made them more, I guess, accessible in that way. And so this is, the music of the 1950s. This is when the civil rights movement is getting its start. And a lot of people say, maybe Brown v. Board of Education, that Supreme Court decision that put black kids and white kids in the same school, made kids of that generation more open to black music. They went to school with black kids, and so maybe they were a little more willing to accept black music than their parents as a result of some of the progress of the civil rights movement. But some people even speculate that maybe it was the other way around, or at least it was like a symbiotic relationship in that sense, that maybe kids who grew up listening to Chuck Berry and Little Richard, who had an appreciation for black music and the black men who sang it, maybe that actually informed the civil rights movement. Maybe rock and roll music had a role in softening white youth and white teens to black people, and therefore made that generation more ready to give black people the equal rights and equal treatment that they were fighting for in society. So in this way, civil rights movement rock and roll music isn't just a reflection of the civil rights movement. It's maybe something that helped to create the civil rights movement and create the kind of racial progress that we saw during this time. Español otra vez. Y chicos, aunque la música de rock and roll representa a mucho progreso racial en los Estados Unidos, también la música de rock and roll inició una reacción muy racista. Y vamos a hablar sobre las razones. Entonces, primero, pueden imaginar la reacción de los adultos, ¿sí? Los adultos no les gustaba el hecho que sus niños escuchaban a la música negra, la música rock and roll. Y pueden imaginar la reacción de un padre blanco al hecho que su niña, su hija, tiene un póster de como Little Richard o Chuck Berry en su habitación, ¿sí? Pueden imaginar los problemas que eso causó en un país muy racista. También la música de rock and roll, muchas personas blancas consideraban la música de rock and roll como música muy vulgar, bestial, demasiado sexual, no apropiado en una como sociedad sofisticada, especialmente considerando que esa música fue tocada por personas negras. Entonces, las insinuaciones sexuales de rock and roll nos parecen como muy agresivos hoy en día con la música que tenemos hoy en día, pero para los años 1950 y 1960 fue radical las referencias al sexo en la música de rock and roll, y especialmente de artistas negros. La comunidad blanca no pensaba que esto fue apropiado. Entonces, lo que hacían, porque rock and roll fue una música popular, lo que hacían algunas compañías es que trataban de cómo hacer la música de rock and roll más apropiada, más blanca. Y eso nos lleva al proceso de blanching. Blanching es el nombre que se usa para describir el proceso de convertir música negra en música blanca, música que es más apropiada para nuestros niños y nuestras familias. Y aquí es un ejemplo de esto. El artista se llama Pat Boone, y lo que van a oír es una canción no escrita por Pat Boone. Es una canción familiar tal vez a ustedes. Es una canción por Little Richard que se llama Tutti Frutti. Pero es la versión como blanca de esta canción, más apropiada para los niños blancos. Mucha más vanilla, sí, a little more vanilla, esta versión de la canción. Y si quieren, chicos, una actividad divertida es comparar las diferencias entre esta versión de la canción y la versión de Little Richard, porque aún había algunos cambios a la letra. There were some lyrical changes. Y son cambios pequeños, pero por notar estos cambios, pueden ver como el proceso de Blanche, las canciones negras. Entonces, la reacción racista, otra vez, una reflexión del entramado social, porque había reacciones racistas al movimiento por los derechos civiles también, ¿sí? Entonces, como había reacciones racistas a Brown v. Board of Education, había reacciones racistas a la música de Little Richard y de Chuck Berry y de rock and roll en general. Last slide. And this is where rock and roll really explodes. Because the one thing that was stopping rock and roll from really exploding, well, on one side you had black people playing black music, but their exposure was limited because of the fact that they were black and all the racist backlash against them. On the other side, you had white people blanching black music and trying to make black music more vanilla, more appropriate for the youth of America. But that wasn't really rock and roll, and so it didn't have the appeal that the music of Chuck Berry and Little Richard did to rebellious young teens. So what the gold mine was going to be for rock and roll is if you could find a white guy who really played black music, who captured the spirit and the soul of rock and roll. And the first guy to really do that is a guy you've all heard of, Elvis Presley. And Elvis Presley wasn't pretend. This wasn't like a white guy that people taught to play black music. This is a guy who grew up around poor whites and poor blacks, listened to country music from whites and rhythm and blues from blacks. And so he authentically grew up listening to both styles of music and was influenced by both styles of music. So Elvis is a good example of the social fabric reflection in that sense, as he grew up poor Southern background around white music and black music. And those influences come out when Elvis Presley plays the guitar. Now, that said, Elvis Presley is very much still accused of being a part of the blanching movement because he did play black music and obviously got a lot more recognition for that music than the black artists who wrote the songs or who originally popularized the style. And so Elvis is controversial in that sense. But nevertheless, Elvis is a great reflection of the social fabric of the time, where he was a little more acceptable to white America, even though still controversial, because he was still very, sexually suggestive, the way he shook his hips and the way he sang. But he was more acceptable than if a black man were doing those things. So I've got one last song that I'll leave you with, The Heartbreak Hotel. And here, listen to the girls. When Elvis Presley starts to shake those hips, this is how you know that rock and roll has arrived. Down at the end of Lonely I just want to show you the part where the girls really go nuts here, because it is ridiculous. There are fainting girls in the audience.
How was that, Loom? Felt a little long, but I thought I'd give it a whirl. Anyway, I hope that was helpful to you. It's designed to be helpful for you to do your daily assignment. And your daily assignment is to take those slides that I just went through with you and give me 5 examples of how those slides, the information on those slides, shows examples of rock and roll being a reflection of the social fabric, what we can learn about American society and American history by learning about the history of rock and roll. And there's plentiful examples there, guys. There's, where rock music comes from, be it the African continent or the South or the North, and how that influenced the music. There's the way certain institutions like slavery and the church had influence in the kind of rock and roll music that came out of those places. There's the racist backlash towards rock and roll, and also the willingness of young people to embrace rock and roll. There's some connections with the civil rights movement there that are definitely reflections of the social fabric. And even like how a guy like Elvis developed to play the kind of music that Elvis plays, the way his place in society influenced the kind of music that he played, is a reflection of the social fabric. So go back, look at those slides. They're linked in the assignment today, so you can go back through them again. But that's the goal. 5 examples of how rock and roll history is a reflection of the social fabric that makes up American history. Hasta mañana.